All right, welcome. We're going to do a slightly different kind of show today than, if there is such a thing as a show that we would typically do, and there probably isn't. But we're going to tell you about a phenomenon here in Connecticut. It's not restricted to Connecticut, but you're going to be kind of surprised, I think, that it's happening at all in Connecticut. And it's a difficult phenomenon to describe. I'll do my best, and then the guests, we have terrific guests here, they'll do a much better job. But it basically involves situations where parents have children with unusually high levels of need in areas ranging from mental health to developmental issues and stuff like that, but ways in which the parents have really had to go and ask for a lot more help than they're getting. They ask the state for the help that they need, either delivered in much more volume at home or possibly some kind of residential treatment facility. And somehow or other, when the process is completed, what has happened is that the parents have wound up surrendering their parental rights. And so we're going to try to tell you this story today. It's been already told before by one of our guests, Juliana Schatz-Preston, Ida B. Wells Fellow with Type Investigations, formerly known as the Investigative Fund, and Reveal, the terrific show Reveal. And she's also an independent filmmaker based in New York. So Reveal has already carried a story about this, and there's a documentary version by the same title, A Desperate Bargain, that she has produced. That's going to be out on Frontline later in April. In studio with me is Bette Gaylor, attorney at Connecticut Legal Services. And then later in the show, you're going to meet some people who have been directly affected by this process, this policy. I almost don't know what to call it because it seems to work in such a strange way. So, Juliana, I probably didn't do a very good job of summarizing this, but you can do a better job. As you, as a reporter, discovered the existence of this practice, what was it that you found that you were discovering?
Sure. I found that there was just a breakdown in the system that we have currently for mental health care. And at the end of the day, parents were facing a critical and desperate choice, or bargain, if you will, with the child welfare system. And that's what led me to this story.
Right. So when we talk about what the parents are facing, they're often facing a situation that it's untenable and maybe a little bit scary. You may have kids who are inflicting physical harm on their parents. You may have kids who are making threatening statements about other children living in the home. You have sort of the kind of situation where you need, as a parent, to be able to turn somewhere and say, I don't have enough help. What else can you give me? So when they do that, what are they typically asking for? What do they ask the state to do for them?
Well, I think immediately the help requested is safety for the child and safety for the family. And often families in crisis have exhausted all of the options that are available to them. I think the first and foremost biggest point to establish is that this is a shared responsibility where the insurance system does not cover such high-level needs of mental health care for children, and as well as different agencies and organizations throughout the state and throughout the country, whether that be the school systems or the Department of Developmental Services, in addition to the Department of Children and Families. So these families have really gone through each agency and ultimately find themselves likely in the emergency room without any other place to go. And it's generally there that they discover this, if you can call it an option, to engage the Department of Children and Families.
Right. And we should say that, and I'll say this more than once over the course of this show, but yeah, some of this is just a resources problem in this. I've been a reporter since 1976. In 1976, I remember a horrible crisis here in Connecticut involving one specific kid who had fallen out of the DCYS, that's what it was called at the time, the old DCF, DCYS pipeline, and a horrible thing had happened. I'm not even going to go through the details. I still remember the kid's name, and everybody said, my God, this is horrible. We got to have blue ribbon panels and multi-part journalism things, and we got to deal with this. And basically, we could have the same kind conversation. That was 76. It's 2019. We're still basically having the same conversation. What happens here in the state of Connecticut are there these eruptions of concern, and probably the last major one involved Adam Lanza, and everybody just says we got to build the system out better so that we can help more people when they need this kind of help. And then it just kind of doesn't happen. A lot of this, what we're going to talk about, is just because the resources are not there. But sometimes they are there. Just difficulty getting them. So, Bette Gaylor, I'm going to turn to you. Once again, this is a very complicated thing to explain to people, and we probably still haven't explained it yet. But somehow or other, these parents who want to take care of their kids and either want to keep their kids in the home with a lot more help than they're getting, or they think their kids need to maybe be in a 24-hour, some kind of residential program for a while. What they're not interested in doing is surrendering parental rights, but that happens. Why does that happen?
Well, it's not so much a surrendering of parental rights, and that matters, but what they do lose is their custodial rights. Yeah. The termination of parental rights means that's once and for all. Mm-hmm. You have it's as if you never had a formal relationship with that child. But relinquishing custodial rights and giving those rights over to the Department of Children and Families means that they relinquish all control and decision-making power over their child's education, over their child's mental health treatment, where the child lives, what medications, if any, the child needs. And although the DCF points out, you can remain part of the decision-making process, that's not how it comes across. And frankly, the biggest concern from my eyes, because it's as you've said, I've been practicing for over 30 years. This was one of the first issues that came up in my early years of practice, and it hasn't changed any. And despite the fact that the legislature took steps in 1997 to say we're prohibiting this, that you cannot ask families to relinquish their custodial rights in exchange for health treatment offered by the Department of Children and Families. And then in 2001, the DCF issued regulations with a lot of admissions restrictions and admission criteria, and the way those have been applied, in my view, has always been in an unconstitutional way, because all of this has to be viewed in the context of our fundamental right in this country, that we have, as citizens and families, we have the right to raise our children as we see fit. And the only time that the state can exercise its awesome power to intrude on that family relationship is when there has been abuse or neglect. And what I can say is these families those are not the families we're talking about.
Right. That's a great point. Let me just turn to Juliana for a second about that. So the operational phrase that keeps coming up is uncared for due to specialized needs, something along those lines. So basically there's some kind of formal declaration that this child has been uncared for because of specialized needs. And I think, as Bette is suggesting, that there's sort of an irony here. These parents are more eager to care for and get care for their kids than maybe even the average parent.
That's exactly right. I think the breakdown happens in the emergency room after someone, either a doctor psychiatrist there or even previously, has recommended, let's say, a residential treatment, and then suddenly that child can't find placement, whether that's due to funding or agreement with the supporting agency, and then suddenly that child or that parent is being told the child needs to be discharged, and the parent is rightfully confused and worried and says, no, I can't take my child home. And all of a sudden, that disagreement over what the child needs and the decision potentially to leave that child at the emergency room triggers involvement with the Department of Children and Families, because the Department of Children and Families will then views that child as essentially abandoned. And so they come in and there's a discussion, and whether or not the neglect petition is filed, what these parents are generally what they're categorized is yes, again, uncared for due to specialized needs. That's sort of the red flag in my reporting as far as who is encountering this sort of situation where they desperately need care, but they can't find a way to provide it. And yet there's this peculiar way of obtaining it by being charged with neglect. And so yes, it is the irony of all ironies to be called or be determined neglectful with this subcategory of uncared for, because at the end of the day, all they want to do is provide care for their
Right. When you learn their stories, you're going to, first of all, see that most of these parents have been willing to attempt something that a lot of us just wouldn't even be willing to try to do in the first place. And that they have taken that very seriously. So, yes, it's very bizarre. And we should also say that one of the problems here is it's hard to know how often this happens. There's a great piece from 2016 by the late, great Elisa Shedikel documenting this. And I think she said the same thing that you said, Juliana, which is it's hard to get an exact number, like how many times a year does this thing happen?
That's exactly right. And that was really the indicator. I mean, initially I did this as a nationwide report, but each state categorizes these things so differently. But in Connecticut, after speaking to dozens of people from agencies, attorneys, doctors, parents, across the board, it's really this uncared for due to specialized need petition that really is emblematic of the situation that's happening. And in my report, I quantified them. This material came from the department, the Judicial Department, and from 2011 to 2018, there were over 1,000 uncared for due to specialized needs.
All right. So I should say that we asked the Department of Children and Families, the people who really know more answers to more questions about this than anybody. We asked them to come on the show today, and they are declining to come on the show. I would just like to say that if I were the governor of Connecticut, I would tell all of my commissioners that if the press makes a reasonable request from you for information about how your agency operates, you have to accede to that request. You can show up on the show and tell me that there's things that you can't talk about because of client confidentiality or whatever. But this whole idea of we're not going on the show doesn't really wash. Anyway, Juliana was lucky enough to talk to somebody from DCF, the Deputy Commissioner of Children and Families, Christina Stevens. So we're going to steal a clip from Reveal, so you can at least hear a little bit about what the official response is about some of these questions.
Well, we do have denials. I mean, we obviously have a 95% acceptance rate. You have families that initially apply and sometimes withdraw and say, I've decided I'm going to move in another direction, or the need is not what I thought it was, or they've got a different clinician. It may have been a difference of opinion where you have a provider who says, I can deliver specifically what's recommended in the home, in the community, and you may have a family who says, I'm not interested in that. These are complicated issues, and they're incredibly hard to do because they are so complicated.
So this 95% compliance rate, or it comes up a lot. We did get a written statement from DCF. I think they mentioned the same thing. So that when they say that, what are they talking about? They're saying if I ask, I need some help with my kid, blah blah blah, they say yes 95% of the time. So why are we having a conversation about this other phenomenon?
Well, I presume that she is talking about a 95% acceptance rate into what the DCF calls its voluntary services program, which was created back in 1997. Regulations didn't come about until 2001 to implement that statute. But it basically was saying, we'll offer you services. The DCF by law is required to provide a continuum of services, whatever is clinically indicated. But there has been a real push in this state to do everything to put services within the home. And for this very high end of small number, relatively speaking, of children who do not function and cannot function in their homes. And the important thing is this is not parents saying, I don't want my kids at home. It's generally parents who have been searching for treatment for their children, and they go to medical professionals or clinicians, psychotherapists, and those people are recommending, you have to, in order to be successful in this treatment, it can't be done within your home. And a takeaway here for me is that it's not about the parenting. It's about the the high needs of the child. So even DCF might say, well, we're going to place your child, we'll take your child out of your house, but it's going to be into a foster care program, a foster home, or a therapeutic group home. And those aren't necessarily what has been recommended for the child.
So let me just go back to Juliana on this, because once again, it would be so helpful if DCF were here so we could ask them questions. But I'm going to take a guess, Juliana, based on your reporting and other stuff, that if DCF were here, what they would say is, look, sometimes just the way things are, the way bureaucracies work, the way regs and laws exist, we can get federal money if we get this kid in our system in a certain way, if this kid's legal status changes. And that's one of the reasons for termination of custodial rights. Or we actually can create eligibility for the delivery of a bigger fire hose of services if the kid is in a therapeutic foster home as opposed to the kid's actual home. So, we don't love this, but this is the way that we do it because resources are scarce, and maybe the thing we really need doesn't even exist because we don't have enough, real residential care. I mean, I don't know. I'm putting words in the mouth of a state agency, Juliana, but I'm just sort of guessing because agencies aren't intentionally mean that there's some reason like that.
Right. I think what you've mentioned about the accessing of federal funding once a child is in foster care, I don't think that DCF would say that, though I do think that's a common sentiment across the board from everybody I've spoken to, not necessarily at DCF. I think that DCF would say fundamentally that residential treatment is not the best option for a child. They believe this very strongly, and that's been repeated to me in a number of interviews. And so they will say that families aren't aware of the community-based resources that exist. That said, when I interview doctors, parents, trying to access whatever they can, those community resources are not as robust as the agency is claiming them to be. I think that every parent would keep their child at home if they could. But in certain instances, as Bet had sort of alluded to, there are very serious things that need to take place for some of these children. They may include what's called a med wash or a close monitoring of medication. The child may be dangerous. And these are not, I think everyone agrees that no child should be institutionalized unnecessarily for an extended period of time. But when it is necessary for, let's say, a short period of time to monitor that medication and get that child to baseline, I think a lot of providers would agree that that's what's necessary. So I think fundamentally, the DCF would probably just say that residential treatment is not what they believe in, and that was certainly the belief of the previous commissioner, and it seems that is now being carried through with the new commissioner. I think, if I may, just make the point that in one of the interviews I conducted with, I'll spare their name, but they said, what's difficult is that when DCF becomes involved, they are the safety net for these children, right? And unfortunately, the primary purpose of the Department of Children and Families is to protect children from child abuse and neglect. Now, many people don't know that they are also the safety net for sort of this children's mental health. And what many people feel is problematic is that when DCF becomes involved, they view things through the lens of their primary focus, which is child abuse and neglect. So DCF may become involved, at the parent's request, and suddenly everything that family is going through is viewed through the lens of the Department of Children and Families, through the lens of child protection. And so one of my interviewees stated very, very eloquently was, well, if you were going through the worst crisis of your life, how well would you present? Mm-hmm. And how would your actions be interpreted? Now, I'm not trying to excuse certain, very valid cases of abuse and neglect that I'm sure certainly exist out there. But a lot of these parents are being scrutinized through that lens. And I think that's where a lot of these problems sort of trip up.
I mean, so I know you got something you want to say about I want to ask you a specific question first. So let's say I'm a parent and I got all kinds of problems with my kid and the kid really is kind of entering a kind of danger zone and I'm working with a clinician and the clinician says, you know what, we're going to put this kid on a med, but this kid really probably needs to be in a residential setting, at least for a while the med's taking effect. And, we got to sort of cool this thing off and blah, 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 blah. And then so why wouldn't that be the end of it? Why would DCF then have the final word about whether that really happens?
Well, it's kind of a tough question to answer.
Okay.
But when you're asking the DCF for mental health treatment services, you might be excluded altogether. So the DCF has admission restrictions, so that, for example, if you and they also have admission criteria. Mm-hmm. If you've ever been in out-of-home placement, if you've ever been the subject of an investigation, if you're involved with the Child Protective Services already, or if your child has been involved in a delinquency matter, that by definition excludes you. However, the commissioner of DCF does hold the right to waive any of those restrictions or admission criteria if she chooses. However,
so there's some kind of internal review process.
There is, and in fact, if a parent has been denied mental health treatment, they are required. This was one of the litigation cases that Legal Services did a number of years ago, because at that time the DCF was not notifying parents of their right to appeal a denial, which is a statutorily created right. So they weren't notifying them in writing of the denial of services, and they weren't denying them of their right to appeal that denial. As far as I know, I'm the only one who's ever actually challenged that denial. So when I filed the appeal, the presiding judge said, "Is she sure she's in the right court?" Because I've never seen one of these before. And it's also one of the biggest things that has concerned me from the get-go about the regulations and how they operate is that I see them as the gatekeeper, because this is not this law is within available appropriations. And that sort of, when you're a family and you have a doctor saying your child needs this, and then you have an agency says, well, we're not going to provide you with that, then you have no place to go.
Right.
And you also and another thing that I think people need to keep in mind is that all of these kids are supposed to be going to school. And a big focus of my practice has always been on the educational component of this. And so it's a huge problem across the state with truancy, chronic absenteeism, disciplinary problems, because these kids are dysregulated at school as well as at home. And so the parents are struggling with all of that. They're worried about the violence in their home. And another real concern is that when the DCF and every place else is shutting the door in their faces, these parents can't defend against what you'd call neglect charges because you're unable to keep yourself and your other children safe. And one of the biggest concerns of my clients has been how traumatizing it is for their other children without disabilities to live in a household with a child who might be extremely violent and unable to regulate in that setting.
Right. So we're going to take a break in just a second. I just want to maybe reframe this for a second. We're going to bring some parents in here, give you some actual experiences with this. But, I mean, as I've tried to understand this story better with the help of my excellent producer, Betsy Kaplan, I just keep thinking the same thing, which is we give a lot of lip service in our society to how much we care about kids. And then even within that framework, how much we care about the most vulnerable kids. And these kids, if they're violent, if they create trouble and stuff like that, it's usually because of some horrible thing that happened earlier on. They saw their birth parent murdered. It's stuff literally like that. And so these are the kids who have the greatest needs in a lot of different ways. And we talk a lot about how we're going to, of course, that would come first in our society. We would build the system that had the carrying capacity to deal with these kinds of kids, because nothing's more important than kids, and no kid is more important than a kid who has had horrible stuff, scarring stuff happen already and is still trying to get his sailboat up right in the water. But the truth is we don't do it. Ultimately, we cut budgets, human services budgets of the state of Connecticut have been cut to the bone, and we all stood around and applauded because we want want our taxes to go down. I mean, it really isn't a whole lot more complicated than that. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that. But somehow or other, the root cause of this, like who's driving this, who's creating this problem, kind of we are, because we really don't want to pay for the kind of society that we claim to believe in. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. All right, our show today is about situations in which parents have pressing and sometimes extreme needs for help with their kids. They go to the state. They go to the state agency charged with helping them. They ask for help, and they don't get the help that they expect that they're getting, and sometimes almost, it seems, the price of any help that they get might be relinquishing of control of custodial rights to their children. So we have still with us Bette Gaylor from Connecticut Legal Services, Julia Schatz-Preston, who has done a piece for Reveal called A Desperate Bargain. There's a Frontline documentary in the works by the same name, should be out in April. And now in studio with us, two people who've really been through this process. Maureen O'Neill Davis, co-founder of Family Forward Advocacy Connecticut, a legislative advocate for the Attachment and Trauma Network, and the adopted parent of two kinship children, and Susan Russell, a parent of three children she adopted from the state welfare system. So, Susan, I'm going to start with you. Just quickly give us a sense of your story. Tell us about your experience as a mother with, in particular, one son who really had some pretty specific issues.
Yes. Hi, Colin.
Hi.
My name is Susan, and I have three adopted children through DCF. Kevin and Rebecca are a sibling set that came to me when they were 7 and 5. And I also have a separate child, Mackenzie, who's related to them through adoption. She's not a sibling. Kevin came to me as a very quiet 5-year-old. Did not really experience much verbal from him. He was very quiet. There were stories of him becoming violent, but I had not seen it. When he was in my home, probably for about 3 or so months, he just kept his tantrums kept becoming greater and greater and greater over time. He has since been in and out of ERs, emergency room care settings. We've also been a part of DCF's voluntary services, received a lot of intensive in-home therapy, probably gone through the program 3 or 4 times. And the program was fine while it was in place. And then shortly over time, those strings are cut due to funding or due to the fact that they feel Kevin is stable and they need to move on to another child. I had to make a decision back in August of 2015 to stop the cycle because what happens is a child gets put into the emergency room. Recommendations are being made for congregate care. He gets to congregate care. He does really well during congregate care. Then they want to discharge home. And in my experience, the discharge plan and his care treatment team was recommending a therapeutic group home before coming to my home. And in order for me to obtain those services for Kevin, I had to voluntarily give up guardianship and decision-making in order for Kevin to get those services in which he was entitled to. And the update is that Kevin has been home in my home since October. I did receive my rights back in January. And so far, so good. Knock on wood, he has not experienced a crisis situation at all. He has been so far very successful.
Let me just ask you a couple of quick questions about this. So you did have to give up your rights.
Absolutely.
You had to sign something saying, and it was probably, once again, that uncared for phrase.
I had to go in front of a judge in tears to tell them that I needed help, that Kevin was recommended this type of care and that he deserved the right to thrive.
And that was in order to get him into the therapeutic group home. And did anybody explain to you why that, and why can't he go to the therapeutic group home and you don't have to give up your status of rights as a parent?
Unfortunately, that was never offered. We're told that this is a service that voluntary services would offer, congregate care through voluntary. However, it was something that they never offered me and my family. In order to get him into that type of care, I had to relinquish guardianship.
But do you know the answer to that question? Like, why? Does this have something to do with Medicaid payments, or it's always money, right? I mean, why can't Kevin just go in there without her having to sign this statement of termination?
Well, two things. When the legislature passed a statute back in 1997 that said, well, you can't condition provision of mental health treatment on commitment, nonetheless, it allowed that other statute to continue to exist, that uncared for statute. It's still out there. And so when kids have such significant needs, and a judge makes a finding that the child has specialized needs, our law still permits the judge to vest custodial rights in the department. So that's still out there.
Permits, but it's weird that it has to. Anyway.
I don't think it has to. And with respect to the other thing that's been bandied about for many years, including back in 2002 when CLS did some litigation against the department, was this issue of what they call Title IV-E funding, which is part of the Social Security Act. And it goes something like this, and I'm certainly no expert here, but that if you want uncapped dollars for the state from the federal government to treat these children, they have to have custodial rights placed in them. However, my reading of the Social Security Act regulation says no. That's not what it says.
Well, just pause for a second. I just don't want us to run out of time because of this. So, at some point, you had to say something to your son about this, right?
Absolutely. It was the worst day of my life.
What did you say?
I sat in a room. It was me, him.
And he's how old at this point?
Right now, he's actually going to turn 16 on Saturday.
So when this happened, though, he was
probably, I want to say, 11 or 12.
Yeah.
He was at the Children's Center of Hampton. He had been there already probably a good year. And we sat in a room with his therapist, myself, and I believe a DCF representative was there, if I'm not mistaken. It's a vision that I don't necessarily want to go back to, but he was sitting with me on a love seat, and I was rubbing and stroking his back, and I said, Kevin, what's the one rule for you to come home? And he said, Ma, I got to be safe. And I said, well, you're still working on that, right? And he said, yeah, I am, Mom, but I'm going to do better. And I said, well, before coming home, Kevin, let's just make sure you can really be safe because, I have Mackenzie at home, I have Rebecca at home, and I just need you to be safe. And so, unfortunately, Kevin, you can't come home right now. And I just wept and just uncontrollably wept.
But what was really happening was he was about to enter a part of his life and a part of the system where you really didn't have decision-making power.
Correct. And this is a child who also has learning disabilities. He is borderline intellectually disabled. He relies on me. He feels only comfortable with me. So to then give up decision-making medically as well as psychiatrically is very difficult. I was at the one point that, the hospital where he was inpatient called me because he had developed strep while being inpatient on a mental health unit. And they could not get clearance to give him Tylenol. And I couldn't even over the phone give authorization for Kevin to get Tylenol while he had strep.
Right. You didn't have the power.
No, I didn't have the power. So, I had to call the DCF hotline to get somebody to call somebody at the hospital to give him authorization to get a Tylenol. And that is heartbreaking for a parent to have to go through that process.
Oh, I would imagine. So I want to make sure we get there's so much ground to cover here. Maureen O'Neill Davis, we haven't heard from you yet. Tell us your story.
Thanks for having me today, Colin. So my husband and I lived in Florida in 2005, and his sister was killed. And shortly following that situation, which was domestic violence in nature, we took in and adopted her two children who had witnessed that crime. Over the next couple of years, we opted to move to Connecticut, where I'm from, and we had made that decision to get our son some medical care. But we ultimately felt that being in New England, where the medical and mental health services are greater than some other states, that whatever would develop with our daughters, that we would be able to meet those needs. Within a short period of time, we began to see a lot of emotional and behavioral challenges with our youngest daughter. We did reach out to the Department of Social Services. We reached out to independent mental health providers. We talked to child care providers who had a greater understanding maybe of certain behaviors. And we really tried to figure out how to best meet her needs. we couldn't even keep a babysitter because her behaviors and how she presented became so challenging for all of us, including babysitters, that we were never able to even, go out to dinner for several years. Fast forward, we relocated from one town to another. We live in Torrington now. And as soon as we got to Torrington, we enrolled both of our girls at Charlotte Hungerford Youth and Families. And it was there that the earlier diagnosis of adjustment disorder that our youngest daughter had been diagnosed with before the age of 3 transitioned into reactive attachment disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And that was the beginning of a very long path with trying to meet her needs. A couple years after that, we had services through Wellspring, which was a service that understands reactive attachment disorder very well. And it was a clinician there that directed us to the Department of Children and Families to access voluntary services as a means to get our daughter into recommended residential treatment.
So just to be clear, so this is this thing that we're talking about. You have a clinician recommending a certain kind of treatment. To get that treatment, you have to relinquish custody of your child.
My statement at that point to the clinician was, we have private insurance. Our daughter also has Medicaid benefit as having been adopted through a state system. Why can't we just go through the admission process? And I was told that due to her age and due to the way the state functions, residential treatment would not be available to us unless we went through voluntary services.
Juliana, you've been listening to all this, and these are stories that you know anyway. But these two parents both seemed to understand at least what was happening, had an opportunity to go through that. Did everybody that you talked to, all the Connecticut parents you talked to, understand what it was they were signing, what it was they were doing in order to get the kind of treatment they were trying to get?
No. Perhaps the understanding was at best superficial. I don't think at the depth did they understand that this would mean that they would no longer be able to make medical decisions or educational decisions for their child. I think many of these parents in crisis are doing whatever they can to stabilize their child. And I don't know if anybody out there listening has been in that type of crisis, but, you're just trying to survive. So perhaps some parents understand. They're a little more well-versed, but I do think that there are parents out there who may be reading the documents and oftentimes, well-intentioned medical professionals, attorneys, social workers, and members of the Department of Children and Families have sort of made light of this uncared for due to specialized needs petition, that it's neglect, but it's not really neglect. So these parents in desperation are not necessarily understanding what they're signing up for.
Maureen, because you also co-founded this network, do you have any sense of how pervasive this is, how often this happens? Does it happen 10 times a year? Does it happen 100 times a year? We don't really know, do we?
So according to the Department of Justice and the work that Lisa Cheticle did in preparation for an article in 2016 on some of our parents, it looks like it happens about 3 times a week in the state of Connecticut. Nationally, the numbers vary, and it depends on how each state functions. In terms of child welfare, developmental services, social services, and who actually has the agency responsibility to step in and provide support or aid to families who are seeking higher level care for these specialized brain development needs or autism with co-occurring mental health needs or serious trauma histories.
So just so we're clear, 3 times a week on average in Connecticut, it looks like, parents are, in order to get a level of treatment or a kind of treatment that their child needs, parents are, quote unquote, voluntarily surrendering their custodial rights. So, like Susan, they couldn't even authorize a Tylenol to a kid with a fever.
That's correct. So some of those neglect petitions citing uncared for due to specialized needs end up being a plea agreement. So some of these children, and I can speak from the standpoint of children diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder with severe symptoms. Those children tend to spin stories and try to play the victim in a lot of situations to gain attention. and for a lot of other reasons as well. They're constantly engaged in their fight, flight, freeze response. They operate from a position of sadness, felt fear, and shame at all times. So they often talk and spin stories about people. So many of our families end up being brought to the attention of the department by way of a neglect allegation as well. And once the mental health needs of the child have been fully vetted through an investigative process and through an extended investigation, if you will, of the family and highly scrutinized, some of those families are permitted to plead down to an uncared for due to specialized needs, opposed to the simple neglect petition.
All right, so we're going to take a break right here because we got one more segment to go. We got everybody here. Everybody's still here. Everybody's staying here. I'll just take this opportunity to make a special thanks to our senior producer, Betsy Kaplan. This is something that she came to me with and said, I think we really have to do this show. When she uses that tone of voice, I always say yes because she's right, and she was. So thanks to Betsy Kaplan. Thanks to Wolfie for running the board today. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back with everybody. All right, we got at least 30 minutes of stuff we need to cover, and we've got 10 minutes to do it in, so that's a problem. So I'm not going to even re-summarize what the show is about. I think hopefully you've been listening with rapt attention so far. Juliana, before we do run out of time, Juliana Schatz-Preston, one thing that you did do, good journalist that you are, is ask, well, who's doing this better? Who's setting up a system where parents who have the utmost concern for their children and want to get help for those children do not wind up surrendering custodial rights with the language that almost makes it sound like they were bad parents? Has anybody figured out how to avoid doing this?
I'm so glad you asked, Colin. I think that it's essential to this story. One thing I didn't see across the country was just a highlighting of how do we fix it. We all agree that there's something wrong. Let's fix it. And I do think that the new commissioner has a tremendous opportunity to seize at this point. A way to go forward. And one person that I spoke to was Liz Manley. She was the former assistant commissioner for the New Jersey's Children's System of Care and their version of DCF. And what they decided to do was create a separate entity that essentially removed the child protection services element out of the equation. And it was called the Children's Behavioral Initiative, and it focused entirely on mental health. So that, let's say, in theory, that's what DCF does now, right? They have voluntary services and then they have the child protection side. Unfortunately, they're far too intertwined, in my opinion, still. But in New Jersey, what they did was they were able to extract the behavioral health element and component to be able to focus on those families without the same social workers that were dealing with child abuse and neglect cases, et cetera. And really, it took a long time, took about 20 years in total. But one thing that was very revealing to me was that Ms. Manley said that it wasn't the legislation or the bills or any of that made the change. It was a fundamental change in culture, and they had to have the governor's backing, really, to change these things. It really, because bills and legislation at the end of the day didn't do anything, because as we know in Connecticut, several bills and legislation haven't done anything. But what they were able to do in New Jersey was really fundamentally from the ground up change things, remove the child protection element out of it, and create a new and separate entity that dealt specifically with children's mental health.
Yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense. The more that you guys talk. By the way, everybody in the studio was nodding when you were talking about this. They like this idea. I just, I want to come back because I just feel like it's so easy to get this part lost. So, Susan, you talked very much, very caringly and very tellingly, I think, about just how hard this was for you to deal with in terms of Kevin and his feelings. What about your feelings? I mean, at a certain point, the language that goes along with this, the structure that goes along with this, it is, as Juliana was just saying, maybe part of the culture of an agency that its main mission, mostly what it does, is protect kids from bad family situations, those kinds of things. That wasn't the case here. I don't know. When you went home when that was all over and you'd signed that thing and you'd been through that hearing, I don't know. What did you say to yourself? Because it must have really hurt. There's a language that's in there that makes it sound like you're the failure.
You feel like a failure.
Yeah.
And I'll never, when I chose these children. These children were not just picked up off the street. I chose Kevin, Rebecca, and Mackenzie. And when you have to stand up in front of a judge and this is called a neglect petition, it is insulting. Beyond words insulting, because since Kevin was in my home at the age of 5, I've done nothing but advocate for him, get him the services in which I was directed to, what I felt was best for him. Meanwhile, trying to support him in his needs and his older sister's needs, because she's seeing this witnessed, and she was afraid that he was going to disrupt to the home to the point where I would choose not to further the adoption or not to continue on. And so she always was walking on eggshells, thinking that someday mom's just going to choose to put her hands up in the air and say she is done. But I firmly committed to those children when I signed my name on those adoption forms. I will follow it through. I would never give up on Kevin, no matter where Kevin is, what Kevin needs. I will be his mother till my dying day. And it's kind of funny because he does, he knows that the only person right now in his world is his mother's got his back. And he'll say that relentlessly. So I know that I'm doing my job from his perspective. But it's, when you feel that people are looking in and are in your home once a week, twice a week, and you know that you are a good parent. I mean, DCF thought that I was a good enough parent to put them in my home in the first place. So to have them, always intrusive on your family life is very, very difficult.
Maureen, we're almost out of time. I don't know. If I could give you the power to change the system somehow, how would you change it?
Well, certainly I would move the Children's Behavioral Health Delivery System of Care Administration out of DCF. I would move it over to an agency, or create an agency that looks more like how DEMIS functions in our state. Yeah. I would also look at how we're administering our Medicaid benefits, look at how we're licensing the residential treatment facilities, both state-operated and privately owned and operated in our state, to allow Medicaid benefits to cover admission to those places. I would also look at how we are looking and administering special education benefits within the school systems. We're putting an overwhelming burden on our school systems to pay for the emotional disturbance category response and accommodations under special education. And it's a great cost, and we need to look at how we're meeting kids' needs early in an effective, respectful, and responsive way to ensure children have a lifespan of success and that their families can be there for them in every possible way, in a healthy way.
Yeah, I'm going to we're really essentially out of time, so I'm going to ask you to do something kind of unfair. I'm going to just go around the people in the room and say, if you had to give a letter grade to how the state of Connecticut is dealing with getting services to families like these families, children like these families, Beth, would you give them a passing grade?
No.
Okay. You'd flunk them. Susan?
Yep.
I would give them a good solid D, only because I felt that they never denied services for me, but the lack of the length that those services last, and that they don't prepare you for when that does happen, is an issue.
All right. Maureen?
F minus.
F minus. All right. Julianne, I'm not going to have you give it a grade because this is not a public radio thing. We just don't do that. So Juliana Schatz.
I wasn't going to give one anyway.
Yeah, I didn't think. I kind of guessed you wouldn't do that. Juliana Schatz Preston has been joining us from the Argo Studios in New York. In studio with me, Bette Gaylor, attorney at Connecticut Legal Services, and two very brave mothers, Maureen O'Neill Davis and Susan Russell, in here to tell their stories. Thank you for listening. We will be back tomorrow.